Virginia's main claim to fame is that it is home to the oldest English permanent settlement in the United States, in the form of Jamestown in 1607. These two qualifiers come from the fact that the Roanoke colony in modern-day North Carolina was founded first in 1585. Ultimately, the colony failed and was found under mysterious circumstances. Also, there were already permanent Spanish settlements in both New Mexico and Florida. In fact, although founded in 1610, 3 years after Jamestown, Santa Fe, New Mexico is the oldest state capital in the US. But this begs the question, why is Richmond and not Jamestown the capital of Virginia, and when was this change made? When looking at state capitals, a few patterns quickly emerge. Rarely is the capital of a state the first city that was founded. While these areas are usually made into improvised places of government, for example, Marietta, Ohio served as the capital of the Northwest Territory, northwest of the Ohio River, but as the areas became more settled, the capital moved west, first to Chillicothe. Often, capitals will move from the territorial origins to areas that were more convenient for travel, and given this was the 18th and 19th century, this normally meant along rivers. For example, Arkansas Post on the Mississippi River was the first capital of Arkansas, before being moved to Little Rock on the Arkansas River in the center of the state. Also, sometimes the desire to be in a central location will be combined with a desire to deliberately avoid making the largest city of a state also the capital, and therefore too politically dominant. Hence why Albany, with a population of 100,000 in the middle of New York State on the Hudson River, is the capital of New York and not New York City itself, with a population of 8 million. Choosing a capital city can often be a contentious issue. For example, in previously mentioned Ohio, the capital moved from Chillicothe to Zanesville twice as different political factions vied for control, until Columbus was chosen as a compromise candidate city and also for its central location and its proximity to river transportation. In Oklahoma, the selection of a state capital ended up in the Supreme Court because of a quirk in the Oklahoma Constitution. The capital of the Oklahoma Territory, an early state, was Guthrie, and the Oklahoma Constitution declared that this could not be changed until after 1913. However, it quickly became clear that Oklahoma City was much more suited to the role, so the move was made ahead of schedule. This led to a lawsuit by angry Guthrie residents arguing that the decision violated the state constitution and went all the way to the Supreme Court. However, it was decided that to deny Oklahoma the right to choose its own capital would be to deny it a right that every other state held. Another case of a contentious process of choosing a capital was in Michigan. It was thought that Detroit was too close to British Canada, having been captured in the War of 1812, and again there was a desire to have the capital be somewhere more politically neutral and not in the largest city. The debate dragged on and on as cities lobbied to be the capital, where eventually legislatures were forced to choose Lansing as a compromise. This provoked a lot of mockery, as at the time the area was little more than a village, and Lansing was, and still is, not even the capital of Ingham County, the only state capital to hold such a distinction. With all this in mind, it isn't surprising that half of US states have moved their capital at least once. And so, what was it that made Virginia do the same? The English who landed in Virginia in 1607 chose to establish their settlement in what would become Jamestown because as an island just offshore, similar to Roanoke, it was easily defensible and fortifiable, while still being a large enough plot of land to build piers and wharves for future shipping, and being at the mouth of the James River meant inland exploration would be easier. Another advantage for the settlers was the island was completely unsettled by Native Americans. Whilst this gave the settlers some feeling of protection, it should have been taken as a hint that this land was not ideal for a colony, as the Native Americans considered the land on the island pretty much useless. The soil was too swampy and too small to support much agriculture, the water was unsuitable for drinking, and the area was plagued by mosquitoes. So unsuitable was the land that 80% of the original colonists died in 1609. They attempted to sail away and abandon the colony. They were met by a supply convoy coming the other way and were returned. To gloss over a lot of Jamestown history, the colony only became sustainable once the growing of tobacco made the colony commercially viable. Jumping forward decades, the colony had grown to encompass much of the Tidewater area of Virginia, steadily expanding northward. This led to increased conflict with the Native Americans in the area. The main reason for this north and westward expansion was that new colonists were arriving all the time in Virginia, and already most of the good land in the east was dominated by the land holdings of the colonial governor, William Berkeley's political allies in the earliest forms of what would become plantations. Also, many of the new settlers were indentured servants, that is, people whose journey to America was paid for by someone else in exchange normally for 7 years of service, with the promise of land after the period was completed. Yet many people were unsatisfied with this arrangement as a result of poor treatment and thus wanted to end the period of service early. And even when the service was over, they either received small amounts of useless land in Native American settlements on the edge of the colony, or even no land at all. So you have a lot of poor colonists on the fringes of the colony and constantly at risk of attack by Indians. This situation caused feelings of resentment towards the colonial authorities to bubble up and find their rallying cry in a man called Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon was a recent arrival to the colony and through a family connection was quickly placed on the governor's council. He was of moderate wealth, owning 2 plantations. Though, in 1676, one of Bacon's overseers was killed during an Indian raid. Bacon went to ask the governor to seek a military commission to attack the Indians, but was rejected. The governor favoured a more defensive posture, trying to encourage as friendly relations with the Indians as possible, but Bacon ignored this, and said there was no way to peacefully coexist with the Indians, saying, "Our design is not only the ruin and destruction of all Indians in general, but all manner of trade and commerce with them," and marched over 400 men to attack a neighbouring tribe, one that had lived relatively peacefully near the colonists and was not involved in the earlier raids. One of the difficulties of settler-Indian relations was that colonists rarely sought to distinguish between those tribes that were hostile and those that were simply nearby. Indians would then retaliate against any nearby settlements, creating an unending cycle of violence. The governor tried to arrest Bacon and had him removed from his council position, but some of Bacon's militiamen were quickly able to force his release. To cut a long story short, this culminated in a showdown where Bacon and his men marched into Jamestown and threatened to shoot the governor if he was not given a commission to make war on the Indians. The governor responded by baring his chest and telling Bacon to shoot, preferring death to giving him a commission. Bacon could see this was going to get him nowhere. However, when Bacon made a similar threat to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the legislative assembly, they quickly capitulated and gave him a commission. It was after this that Bacon issued his famous Declaration of the People of Virginia, which laid out his and the various colonists' grievances against the governor and the colonial authorities. These included 1. Overtaxation with little effect. 2. The government corruption and the appointment of the governor's political favourites to judicial positions. 3. Personal enrichment of the governor and his monopoly over the beaver trade. 4. Failure to protect the colonists from Indian raids. 5. Not letting the army pursue raiding Indians. 6. Failure to raise enough forces when settlements were attacked. 7. Appointment and installing a person in a position of power against the people's consent, i.e. the office of governor itself. And 8. Being more concerned with internal civil disorder than the external threat from Native Americans. This declaration was seen by some, including Thomas Jefferson, as a prelude to the American Revolution and one of the first acts of concerted rebellion against colonial authority and the Crown. However, Bacon's near genocidal attitude toward the Native Americans has diminished his reputation in modern times. Later, Bacon laid siege and burned Jamestown to the ground, whilst the governor fled. In the end, the rebellion was something of an anticlimax as Nathaniel Bacon died shortly afterwards of dysentery. Without his leadership, and with reinforcements arriving, what little rebellion there was quickly crushed. Physical damage wasn't the only effect of Bacon's rebellion. Since Bacon's militia was mostly made of indentured servants, this hastened the move away from indentured servitude and towards the greater use of enslaved Africans as labour. However, Bacon's army also included a number of black people, both free and enslaved. This coalition of poor whites and free and enslaved black people terrified the plantation aristocracy. This led the colonial authorities to enact much stricter slave codes to drive a wedge between blacks and whites and to avoid such a coalition ever forming again. From 1705, blacks could not own firearms or employ white servants, and this law protected the property rights of slave owners and allowed for the apprehension of suspected runaways. To backtrack slightly, with Jamestown burned to the ground when Governor Berkeley returned, a new temporary government headquarters was needed. They found one in an area much further inland called Middle Plantation. This, at first temporary location, was found to be much more hospitable and safer than Jamestown and less prone to mosquitoes. Whilst it would take years to build up Middle Plantation into a sizable settlement, when the Jamestown courthouse burned down again in 1698, this was the final straw, and Middle Plantation, now Williamsburg, became the state capital at last. That's one move of the state and colonial capital, but it still doesn't get us to Richmond. Williamsburg remained the capital of Virginia throughout the rest of the colonial period. The reason it did not stay capital is relatively simple when compared to Jamestown. Williamsburg was a hotbed of revolutionary fervour during the American Revolution, with firebrand Patrick Henry making his famous treason speech, saying that in former times Tarquin and Julius had their Brutus, Charles had his Cromwell, and I do not doubt but some good American will stand up in favour of his country. As conflict between the Patriots and the colonial governor grew, and afraid that the Patriots would arm themselves, as happened in Massachusetts after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Governor Lord Dunmore had the stores of ammunition removed from Williamsburg and placed in ships near Norfolk. Fearing the seizure of munitions was a precursor to British military action, this provoked a general uprising in Virginia. Again, to oversimplify, the Patriots gained control over most of Virginia. Having lost control over the mainland, the British used the main advantage they had left: sea power. They shelled Norfolk City and launched raiding parties in an effort to gain supplies and start more fires. Since the area was ironically known for its loyalist sympathies, the American Continental Army retaliated by setting yet more fires and targeting loyalist homes. As you can probably predict, this led the new state government in Williamsburg, now headed by the first governor, the aforementioned Patrick Henry, to fear that the British would sail up the James and shell Williamsburg to rubble as well. And so the obvious decision was made to relocate the capital again inland to Richmond. That was more defensible and once again in a more central location, as the population had shifted westward in the years since 1700. Unfortunately, even this did not prove to be far enough away from the fighting, as British forces, under the command of Benedict Arnold, a former Continental Army officer who had defected and joined the British, a man who has now become the epitome of evil and treachery, a legacy which still finds itself in our popular culture today. Arnold's forces captured and burned Richmond before being eventually driven back. Although the city was severely damaged, unlike Jamestown and Williamsburg, it quickly recovered and remained a fairly prosperous city until the end of the Civil War. It's fascinating to see how something as seemingly minor as asking why a state capital is where it is today can be linked to so much else, with history, geography, and politics all wrapped up into one. The story of Virginia's capital shows three phases of its early life, from a commercial experiment on the fringes of a continent to a prosperous yet turbulent and conflicted colony, and finally as the hotbed of revolution and the mother of presidents. Often there is a historical reason for why things are the way they are, and for every question there is an answer waiting to be discovered. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.